In the dense jungles of Vietnam, something unprecedented happened. The North Vietnamese Army, a professional military force that had fought the French and Americans without flinching, issued orders that shocked intelligence analysts. If you encounter Australians, do not engage. Withdraw immediately. How did small teams of 4 to 6 men force an entire army to rewrite their combat doctrine? The document was smudged, water-stained, and recovered from the body of a North Vietnamese Army officer killed in Phuoc Tuy province in 1969. When Australian intelligence officers translated it, they discovered something that would validate years of brutal training and tactical excellence. It was a standing order, distributed to NVA units operating in areas with known or suspected Australian presence. The directive was clear and unambiguous. Identify, report, and withdraw. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary, and only with overwhelming force. This wasn't a suggestion. This was doctrine. The North Vietnamese Army, a highly disciplined regular military force with sophisticated command structures and professional officer corps, had institutionalized avoidance of Australian Special Air Service patrols. In the history of modern warfare, such acknowledgements are extraordinarily rare. Armies don't typically change their operational doctrine to avoid small enemy units, unless those units have proven themselves lethally effective on a consistent, predictable basis. Between 1966 and 1971, the Australian SAS regiment operating in South Vietnam achieved something that elite forces dream about, but seldom accomplish. They didn't just conduct successful operations. They didn't simply rack up impressive kill ratios or complete difficult missions. They became so consistently dangerous that a professional enemy army recognized them as a threat requiring institutional response. The NVA didn't fear Australian soldiers in the emotional sense. They calculated that engaging them rarely produced favorable outcomes and frequently resulted in disproportionate casualties, lost officers, and compromised operations. To understand how this happened, you need to understand the battlefield and the enemy. Phuoc Tuy province, southeast of Saigon, was Australian operational responsibility. It wasn't the most strategic province in South Vietnam. It didn't contain vital ports like Da Nang or critical infrastructure like the Mekong Delta, but it sat astride infiltration routes that North Vietnamese forces used to move troops and supplies toward the capital. Control of Phuoc Tuy meant control of these routes. The terrain was unforgiving, a mixture of dense jungle, rubber plantations, rice paddies, and scattered villages. It was ideal guerrilla country, offering concealment, multiple routes of movement, and civilian population that could be controlled or co-opted. The enemy in Phuoc Tuy came in 2 varieties, and the distinction mattered. The Viet Cong were irregular forces, guerrillas who lived among the population, conducted hit-and-run attacks, planted mines, and melted away when faced with superior force. They were dangerous, committed, and knew the terrain intimately, but they weren't the enemy that issued the withdrawal orders. That was the North Vietnamese Army, something entirely different. The NVA were professional soldiers. They had formal rank structures, standardized training, military discipline, and operational planning capabilities. They conducted coordinated attacks, maintained supply lines, and operated with strategic objectives handed down from division and corps headquarters. NVA units that moved through Phuoc Tuy weren't scattered guerrilla bands. They were infantry battalions, sapper units, logistics elements, and command groups moving with purpose and organization. They had military intelligence capabilities, after-action review processes, and institutional memory. When the NVA learned something, it got documented, analyzed, and incorporated into future operations. This institutional sophistication is precisely why their response to Australian SAS operations is so significant. The NVA weren't reacting emotionally to a few bad experiences. They were recognizing a pattern, analyzing the tactical problem, and implementing a doctrinal solution. The problem was this: NVA units operating in areas with Australian presence were being ambushed and destroyed by forces too small to detect in advance, but too lethal to engage without massive preparation. Australian SAS patrols typically consisted of 4 to 6 men. In the vast expanse of Vietnamese jungle, 4 men are essentially invisible if they know what they're doing, and Australian SAS knew exactly what they were doing. They moved slowly, methodically, sometimes covering only a few kilometers per day. They avoided trails, bypassed obvious routes, and moved through terrain that most forces considered impassable. They didn't talk. Hand signals only. No smoking, no cooking fires that produced smell, nothing that could compromise their position. When they stopped, they established all-around security and remained motionless for extended periods, watching and listening. These patrols would insert by helicopter into remote areas, sometimes staying in the jungle for weeks at a time. Their mission was reconnaissance and ambush. Find the enemy, report their location and movements, and if the opportunity presented itself, destroy them. The reconnaissance role was vital. Australian intelligence built detailed pictures of enemy movement patterns, base areas, and supply routes based on SAS reports. But it was the ambush role that built the reputation. The Australian SAS didn't invent the military ambush. Ambush tactics are as old as warfare itself. What they did was refine the ambush to a level of technical excellence that turned it into something approaching an exact science. Every aspect was carefully calculated. Site selection came first. The ideal ambush site had clear fields of fire, natural barriers that channeled enemy movement, covered positions for the ambush team, and multiple escape routes. Australian patrols would identify these sites during their reconnaissance, sometimes marking several potential locations along known enemy routes. When the decision was made to conduct an ambush, preparation was meticulous. The kill zone, the area where the enemy would be engaged, was precisely defined. Every man knew his sector of fire. The patrol leader designated the trigger, the point at which the ambush would be initiated. This was usually when the maximum number of enemy soldiers were in the kill zone. Trigger discipline was absolute. You didn't fire because you saw a target. You fired when the commander initiated or when you were compromised. Firing prematurely meant killing fewer enemy and giving survivors time to react. The ambush itself was devastating. At the signal, usually the patrol commander firing the first shots, the kill zone erupted. 4 to 6 men with automatic weapons, grenades, and claymore mines could generate an extraordinary volume of accurate fire. The L-shaped ambush formation, favored by Australian SAS, was particularly effective. The main killing element formed one arm of the L, firing into the enemy's flank. A secondary element formed the other arm, positioned at the end of the kill zone to catch anyone who tried to escape. Enemy forces caught in this crossfire had nowhere to go. Moving forward meant staying in the kill zone. Moving backward meant crossing through fire from the secondary element. Taking cover meant becoming static targets. The ambushes lasted seconds, perhaps a minute or two at most. Then came the immediate withdrawal. Australian SAS didn't stick around to count bodies or collect souvenirs. They fired, inflicted maximum casualties, and extracted rapidly along pre-planned routes. This wasn't cowardice or caution. It was tactical soundness. Staying near the ambush site meant risking enemy reinforcements, allowing survivors to organize counterattacks, or becoming the target of enemy artillery or mortars. The goal was to kill the enemy and survive to do it again, not to hold ground or prove bravery. But here's where Australian tactics became truly sophisticated, and where the NVA learned their most painful lessons. Australian SAS patrols rarely operated in complete isolation. They maintained radio contact with fire support bases, artillery batteries positioned to provide supporting fires across their operational area. If an SAS patrol made contact with the enemy, they could call for artillery support within minutes. Those 4 to 6 men on the ground weren't alone. They had 105mm or 155mm howitzers ready to drop high-explosive shells on any coordinates they provided. The tactical implications were profound. An NVA unit that encountered an Australian patrol faced a terrible dilemma. If they broke contact and withdrew, the Australians would track them and call in artillery. If they attempted to assault the patrol and overrun it with superior numbers, they would likely walk into a prepared position, while artillery fire landed on their assembly areas and approach routes. If they attempted to maneuver around the patrol to cut off their escape, they exposed themselves to airstrikes. Royal Australian Air Force helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft maintained close coordination with SAS ground elements. A call for air support could bring gunships or fighter bombers within 10 to 15 minutes. The NVA discovered this integration the hard way, through repeated painful experiences. A typical encounter would begin with an NVA unit, perhaps a company of 60 to 80 men, moving along a jungle trail or through a rubber plantation. An Australian patrol would have identified this movement pattern days earlier, positioned themselves along the route, and waited. The ambush would erupt, killing or wounding a dozen men in the first seconds. The NVA commander, recognizing he was facing a small unit, would attempt to organize an assault to overwhelm the ambushers. This decision, tactically sound against most small units, became a trap when facing Australians. As the NVA company maneuvered to assault, the SAS patrol would have already radioed coordinates. Artillery fire would begin landing, not randomly, but precisely on the NVA assembly areas and approach routes. The NVA would find themselves taking casualties from artillery, while trying to close with an enemy they could barely locate. If they pressed the attack, airstrikes might arrive, adding rockets and cannon fire to the artillery. By the time the NVA actually reached the ambush site, the Australians would have withdrawn, leaving behind a company that had suffered perhaps 20 or 30 casualties, lost multiple officers and NCOs, and gained absolutely nothing. The targeting of officers was deliberate and devastating. Australian SAS recognized that NVA leadership was the center of gravity for enemy units. Kill or wound the officers and senior NCOs, and you decapitate the unit's command structure. NVA officers could be identified by their position in formation, their equipment, and their behavior. They carried maps, radios, and gave orders. In an ambush, they were priority targets. Australian patrol commanders briefed their men before every ambush. Identify and engage officers first. The impact was cumulative. NVA units that engaged Australians didn't just suffer casualties. They lost the leaders who held the unit together, made tactical decisions, and maintained discipline. The NVA after-action reports, those that were later captured by Australian or American forces, reflected growing frustration. The reports documented the pattern: initial contact with small Australian patrol, attempt to engage or pursue, artillery fire called on NVA positions, heavy casualties, particularly among officers. Australian patrol successfully extracts, mission compromised or abandoned. The cycle repeated across Phuoc Tuy province and adjacent areas wherever Australian forces operated. Intelligence officers reading these captured documents began to see references to Australian tactics, descriptions of their ambush techniques, and increasingly, recommendations to avoid contact unless conditions were favorable. The favorable conditions were revealing. NVA reports suggested engaging Australians only with overwhelming numerical superiority, only in terrain that prevented rapid artillery support, only when air cover was unavailable due to weather, and only when the tactical objective was absolutely critical. These conditions rarely aligned. Australian SAS deliberately operated in areas where artillery could support them. They coordinated with aviation to ensure air assets were available. They timed operations to avoid weather that would ground aircraft. The NVA was effectively being told, only fight Australians when all their advantages are negated, which almost never happens. The standing orders that formalized this avoidance were discovered through multiple sources over several years. Some were found on captured prisoners, written orders carried by officers or political cadre. Others were described during interrogations when NVA prisoners, particularly officers, were questioned about their operational procedures. The orders varied slightly in wording but were consistent in content. If your unit identifies Australian forces through any means, you are to immediately report the contact to higher headquarters, provide precise location information if possible, maintain observation if you can do so without being detected, and withdraw to a safe distance. You are not to engage unless the Australians are clearly isolated from support, unless you have overwhelming numerical advantage, or unless withdrawal is impossible. The identification criteria were specific and showed how carefully the NVA had studied their enemy. Australian uniforms differed from American patterns. Australian equipment, particularly weapons and load-bearing gear, had distinctive characteristics. Australian radio procedures and voice communications had recognizable accents even when speaking Vietnamese or using radio brevity codes. Most tellingly, Australian patrol movement patterns differed from American operations. Americans often moved faster, in larger groups, with more equipment. Australian SAS moved slowly, in small teams, with minimal gear. An experienced NVA soldier could potentially identify Australian operations based purely on observed behavior. The psychological impact of these orders on both sides was significant. For Australian soldiers, particularly SAS troopers, the knowledge that the enemy had institutionalized avoiding them was enormously validating. Special Forces soldiers train constantly, push themselves through brutal selection courses, and maintain grueling operational tempos. Learning that your enemy respects your capabilities enough to change their doctrine provides powerful confirmation that the training and sacrifice matter. It builds confidence, reinforces aggressive tactics, and creates a positive feedback loop. The more Australians pressed operations, the more the NVA avoided them, which gave Australians even more operational freedom. For the NVA, the orders created tactical constraint and frustration. Military forces want to control terrain, interdict enemy operations, and accomplish assigned missions. Being told to avoid contact with certain enemy units limits operational flexibility. NVA commanders operating in Phuoc Tuy province had to factor Australian presence into every operational decision. Route selection became more complex. Timing of movements changed to avoid peak Australian patrol activity. Some operations were delayed or cancelled entirely because intelligence suggested Australian forces were operating in the planned area. The standing orders were practical and saved NVA lives, but they also handed operational initiative to the Australians. This achievement becomes even more remarkable when compared to American operations in Vietnam. American forces were larger, better equipped, and had vastly more firepower available. U.S. Army and Marine Corps units conducted extensive combat operations, killed enormous numbers of enemy soldiers, and controlled large swaths of territory. Yet there's no equivalent evidence of NVA issuing blanket avoidance orders for American units. The NVA certainly respected American firepower and avoided pitched battles when possible, but they didn't create specific doctrinal responses to avoid contact with U.S. forces the way they did for Australians. The difference wasn't in courage or fighting ability. American soldiers fought bravely and effectively throughout the war. The difference was in operational approach and scale. American operations tended to be larger, more visible, and more dependent on overwhelming firepower and mobility. Search and destroy missions might involve entire battalions sweeping through areas, supported by massive artillery and air power. These operations killed enemy soldiers and disrupted their activities, but they were also predictable. The NVA could often detect large American operations in advance, avoid contact until the operation ended, and then return to the area. Australian SAS operations were different in character. They were smaller, quieter, and longer in duration. A four-man patrol operating for 2 weeks in enemy territory was harder to detect and harder to predict than a battalion-sized operation that lasted 3 days. The Australians weren't trying to control large areas. They were trying to find, fix, and destroy specific enemy units. They operated inside the NVA's decision cycle, identifying targets and calling in strikes before the enemy could react. They were patient, willing to wait days for the perfect ambush opportunity, rather than forcing contact. The integration of intelligence, maneuver, and fires was another crucial difference. Australian operations were intelligence-driven. SAS patrols fed information to intelligence analysts, who identified patterns and predicted enemy movements. This intelligence drove future patrol planning, creating a cycle that became increasingly effective over time. When Australians conducted an ambush, it wasn't opportunistic. It was planned based on predicted enemy movement and supported by coordinated artillery and air assets. American operations certainly used intelligence and coordination, but the scale and complexity sometimes made that coordination more difficult. A four-man patrol can make decisions and execute changes faster than a battalion-sized force. There's also the question of operational tempo and consistency. Australian SAS maintained a high operational tempo throughout their deployment. Patrols were constantly in the field. The enemy never had extended periods where they could be confident Australian patrols weren't operating in their area. This constant presence created cumulative psychological pressure. NVA units moving through Phuoc Tuy province had to assume they might encounter Australian patrols at any time, on any route. That assumption changed behavior. Units moved more cautiously, which slowed operations. They avoided certain areas entirely, which reduced their operational flexibility. They committed more troops to security and reconnaissance, which reduced the forces available for offensive operations. The standing orders themselves represent a fascinating case study in military adaptation. The NVA were not incompetent or cowardly. They were a professional military force that had been fighting for decades against multiple opponents. They had defeated French colonial forces in 1954. They were currently fighting the American military, the most powerful armed force in human history, to a standstill. This was not an army prone to panic or irrational decisions. Their decision to formalize avoidance of Australian SAS was a calculated response to a specific tactical problem. From the NVA perspective, the math was simple. Engaging Australian patrols cost casualties, particularly among leadership, and rarely achieved any meaningful tactical gain. The Australians would call in artillery or air support, inflict disproportionate losses, and extract successfully. Even when NVA units killed or captured Australian soldiers, which did happen occasionally, the cost in NVA casualties and disrupted operations usually exceeded any benefit. From a purely utilitarian perspective, avoiding contact when possible and only engaging under favorable conditions made perfect sense. This pragmatic calculation is actually a form of respect. The NVA weren't acknowledging Australian cultural superiority or making some broad statement about Western military dominance. They were recognizing that this specific enemy, employing these specific tactics in this specific environment, consistently produced unfavorable outcomes. It was military professionalism recognizing military professionalism. The NVA made a cold calculation that discretion was the better part of valor when it came to Australian SAS. The discovery of these standing orders by Australian intelligence created significant operational advantages. Knowing that the enemy had orders to avoid contact changed how Australian forces planned operations. They could use SAS patrols as economy of force elements, covering large areas with small teams, because those teams were unlikely to be deliberately engaged. They could position patrols to channel enemy movement away from certain areas, effectively using the NVA's own avoidance doctrine against them. If you know the enemy will withdraw when they identify your presence, you can use that knowledge to predict where they'll go and position forces accordingly. The intelligence also provided insights into NVA decision-making and priorities. The specificity of the identification criteria showed how carefully the NVA studied Australian operations. The conditions under which engagement was authorized revealed what the NVA considered critical objectives worth the risk. The reporting requirements indicated how the NVA intelligence system functioned and what information they considered valuable. All of this fed back into Australian operational planning, creating advantages that extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. The legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam extended well beyond the war itself. The reputation established in Phuoc Tuy province became part of the regiment's identity and institutional culture. Future generations of SAS soldiers were trained to that standard, with Vietnam veterans emphasizing the importance of patience, preparation, and precision. The tactical techniques refined in Vietnamese jungles were codified in training programs and passed down through decades. The integration of small unit tactics with supporting arms became a hallmark of Australian special operations. More broadly, the Vietnam experience demonstrated principles that remain relevant in modern special operations. Quality matters more than quantity when it comes to highly trained forces. A few exceptionally skilled soldiers, properly supported and intelligently employed, can create effects far beyond their numbers. Integration with supporting arms multiplies effectiveness. Intelligence-driven operations produce better results than random patrolling. Patience and discipline trump aggression and speed in many tactical situations. These lessons, learned in Vietnamese jungles, apply to special operations conducted in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other contemporary conflicts. The concept of achieving recognition in enemy doctrine represents perhaps the highest form of tactical validation. Awards and medals are given by your own side, reflecting your military's assessment of performance. Media coverage and public recognition reflect popular opinion. But when your enemy changes how they operate specifically because of what you do, that's pure military effectiveness. The enemy isn't trying to flatter you or build your reputation. They're trying to survive and accomplish their missions. If they conclude that avoiding you is the best way to do that, it means your effectiveness is undeniable. In the specific case of Australian SAS in Vietnam, this recognition was particularly meaningful because it came from a sophisticated, professional enemy. The NVA weren't poorly trained militia or insurgent groups with limited military capability. They were the army that would eventually defeat South Vietnamese forces and American-backed government. They would go on to fight Chinese forces in 1979 and maintain one of Southeast Asia's most powerful militaries. This was a serious, competent military organization. Their institutional decision to avoid Australian SAS wasn't born from ignorance or fear. It was born from hard experience and rational analysis. The story also illustrates the limits of technology and resources in military effectiveness. The Australian military in Vietnam was not the best equipped force in theater. That distinction belonged to the Americans, who had helicopters, artillery, jet aircraft, electronic surveillance, and logistics capabilities that dwarfed Australian resources. Yet in terms of creating specific tactical effects and achieving recognition from the enemy, the Australians arguably exceeded American achievements in certain dimensions. They did this through training, discipline, tactical innovation, and operational art, not through material superiority. There's a broader lesson here about the nature of military effectiveness. Armies often focus on platforms and technology, seeking advantage through better weapons, vehicles, or electronics. These things matter, certainly, but the Australian SAS experience suggests that tactical excellence, unit cohesion, intelligent operational planning, and consistent execution can produce effects that match or exceed what technology alone provides. 4 men who know exactly what they're doing, supported properly and employed intelligently, can change how an entire enemy army operates. The human dimension is also worth considering. Every Australian SAS soldier who conducted these patrols was a volunteer who had passed through one of the world's most demanding selection and training programs. They chose to spend weeks in hostile jungle, constantly at risk of detection and attack, living on minimal rations, unable to relax or let down their guard. They did this repeatedly, patrol after patrol, deployment after deployment. The physical demands were enormous. The psychological stress was constant. The risk of death or capture was ever present. Yet they maintained discipline and effectiveness over years of operations. Similarly, the NVA soldiers who received orders to avoid Australian patrols were also doing their duty in difficult circumstances. They were operating far from home, in dangerous conditions, facing an enemy with significant advantages in firepower and mobility. The standing orders to withdraw when encountering Australians weren't a reflection of cowardice, but of their commanders' responsibility to preserve their lives and combat effectiveness. Military leadership is about accomplishing missions while minimizing unnecessary casualties. The NVA commanders who issued these orders were fulfilling that responsibility. The intersection of these two professional military forces, each trying to accomplish their missions and protect their soldiers, created the dynamic that led to the standing orders. The Australians refined their tactics to maximum lethality. The NVA adapted their doctrine to minimize losses. This is military evolution in its purest form, driven by survival and effectiveness rather than theory or ideology. Neither side had the luxury of being wrong. Mistakes meant dead soldiers and failed missions. The fact that NVA doctrine evolved to avoid Australian patrols demonstrates that Australian tactics were consistently effective enough to force that evolution. Looking back over 5 decades, the story of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam and the NVA response remains instructive. It shows that small, highly trained, properly supported units can achieve strategic effects. It demonstrates that consistent tactical excellence builds reputation and psychological advantages. It illustrates how intelligence-driven operations produce better results than simple aggression. It proves that integration of maneuver and fires multiplies effectiveness. And most fundamentally, it reminds us that in warfare, the ultimate validation comes not from your own side's praise, but from your enemy's respect, demonstrated through their decisions and doctrine. The captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and after-action reports that revealed the NVA's standing orders weren't just intelligence material. They were testimony to the effectiveness of Australian special operations in one of the 20th century's most challenging conflicts. In the dense jungles of Puoc Tui province, 4- to 6-man patrols achieved something that entire divisions sometimes fail to accomplish. They forced a professional enemy army to recognize them as a threat requiring institutional response. They made themselves so consistently dangerous that avoidance became doctrine. They proved that excellence, discipline, and tactical mastery can overcome numerical disadvantage and create lasting military effects. That achievement stands as one of the remarkable special operations successes in modern military history. If you found this story as remarkable as we did, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold military history. Hit that like button if you appreciate learning about tactical excellence, and drop a comment below. What other special operations stories would you like us to cover? Your support keeps these stories alive.